For 800,000 years, Owens Lake contained water. In just 13, it was drained away, and for almost 100 years afterward, its bare lake floor, a 100 square mile stretch of poisonous salt flat trapped between the Sierra Nevada and the Inyo Mountains, created the worst particulate air pollution ever measured in the United States. Every year, 80,000 tons of toxic dust lifted off that basin. The solution was completely industrial. Los Angeles was required to pump water back over the lakebed, not so the lake could be filled again, not to bring back what had been lost, but simply to keep the dust down. Thin sheets of water were spread across geometric grids. Salt grass was placed in laser-leveled rectangles, and gravel covers 4 inches thick were laid down. No one set out to create habitat. No one brought wildlife back. The order was to satisfy federal air quality rules, and the money was meant only for dust suppression. But within months, after the first water reached the basin, living things began to appear. Algae spread through the warm, shallow water. Flies emerged in the millions. Then the birds arrived, more than 100,000 of them on a single spring day, falling from the sky onto engineered ponds that, in satellite images, look like a circuit board stamped into the desert. Before 1913, Owens Lake was a saline inland sea covering 100 square miles. It was shallow, never much deeper than about 50 feet. Yet it was large enough to carry commercial steamboats during the silver boom of the 1870s. The Bessie Brady, an 85-foot steamboat, transported 30-ton loads of silver bullion from the Cerro Gordo mines across the lake to freight depots on the far shore. Communities stood along the water's edge. Keeler, on the eastern side, had 5,000 people living there. Then William Mulholland constructed the Los Angeles Aqueduct. Finished in 1913, it diverted the Owens River, the lake's main source of water, and carried it 233 miles south to supply the expanding city of Los Angeles. Cut off from its inflow, the lake failed. By 1926, 13 years after the diversion started, the whole body of water had vanished, and after that, the dust began. What made it so extreme was the particular chemistry of the basin. Most dry salt flats, the Bonneville Flats in Utah, for example, are mostly sodium chloride. That is ordinary table salt, and it dries into a firm, durable crust. Owens Lake works very differently. The minerals that built up here through 800,000 years of evaporation are mainly sodium carbonate and sodium sulfate. They are the chemical signature of Sierra Nevada granite that weathered down into the basin over that same span of time. These salts do not create a solid surface. Instead, they form a soft, airy, powder-like layer resting on the ground almost like loose flour. And the lakebed continues to make new powder. The water table lies less than 10 feet beneath the surface. Groundwater is constantly pulled upward through the clay by the same principle as a paper towel sitting in water. When that moisture arrives at the surface and evaporates, it leaves behind another coating of powdery salt. During winter, sulfate crystals expand as they take in moisture, splitting and lifting the clay from within. During summer, they dry, shrink, and break down into fine dust. That cycle happens again and again, every year. The surface never becomes stable. When the valley winds strike that powder, and they strike with force, channeled between the 14,000-foot Sierra Nevada and the 11,000-foot Inyo Range, like air squeezed through a nozzle, the result is brutal and mechanical. Larger grains of sand skip across the ground, slamming into the fragile crust like tiny projectiles. Every collision throws clouds of microscopic particles into the air. The dust is 10 times thinner than a human hair, and it carries arsenic, cadmium, and nickel that accumulated in the basin over hundreds of thousands of years. 40,000 people live downwind. The dust storms, which locals called Keir fogs, arrived like major weather events. Emergency rooms filled with asthma attacks and respiratory failure. People sealed up their houses and put in hospital-grade air filters. One local resident shelled out $8,000 for specially made dual-pane windows simply to keep the dust from sending her to the hospital over and over. Out on Highway 395, the main route cutting through the valley, the dust storms triggered massive multi-vehicle collisions because nobody could see a thing. 90 miles farther south, the United States Navy's China Lake weapons testing installation had to scrub flight operations again and again. Every single scrub ran up costs of as much as $50,000, since the dust could scratch up jet turbine blades and wreck sensitive targeting sensors. Back in 2001, air quality monitors logged a 24-hour dust density of 20,750 micrograms per cubic meter. To put that in perspective, the federal safety standard is just 150. That measurement came in at 140 times beyond the legal ceiling, the most extreme particulate concentration ever documented anywhere in the United States. For year after year, LWP denied any accountability. Their water rights had been secured long before modern environmental regulations existed. A local county air pollution official by the name of Ted Shade shattered the stalemate by invoking a California law that empowered his district to make the city financially accountable for air contamination stemming from its long-standing water diversions. Shade triggered a legal showdown that dragged on for years. By 1998, LWP had put their signature on a legally enforceable deal taking on complete financial and operational ownership of the dust problem, and construction got underway in 2000. Yet the city refused to back down, contesting the order in federal court, even while pouring the concrete and laying the pipes. In 2012, a federal judge threw the case out completely, putting a stop to more than 10 years of courtroom opposition. The solution would end up carrying a price tag of $2.1 billion, and it demanded the very thing the lake had been stripped of to get in the first place. What killed the dust was water. Beginning in 2000, LWP started constructing the most extensive single-source dust suppression undertaking ever attempted in North America. 3 different techniques were rolled out at the same time across 49 square miles of poisonous dry lake bed. The chief tool was water itself. Currents from the Los Angeles aqueduct were sent flowing across the lake bed in shallow layers, collecting behind thousands of low-dirt walls that carved the playa into controllable sections. Hold 75% of the surface damp throughout dust season, and that powdery crust never gets the chance to develop. If the crust never develops, there's nothing for the wind to tear apart. In spots where flooding made no sense, they put in saltgrass, a hardy indigenous plant that thrives in ground twice as salty as ocean water, planted across laser-leveled plots and watered with carefully timed bursts. Once it takes hold, the thick web of roots and stems slashes wind velocity right at the surface and catches blowing sand before it can skip into the crust. The third strategy cut water out of the equation altogether. A 4-inch blanket of rough gravel spread atop a fabric barrier cuts off the link between groundwater below and the surface above. If no moisture makes it to the top, no salt can crystallize. No salt means no dust. The thing is, gravel supports zero growth. From a biological standpoint, it's completely lifeless terrain. Not a single one of these approaches was meant to bring back wildlife. They existed to nail one specific regulatory target, 99% dust suppression effectiveness. And by 2018, they had actually surpassed it. Maximum dust measurements plunged from 20,750 micrograms per cubic meter down to 728. The yearly count of days breaching the federal standard plummeted from 49 to 8, a 96.12% cut in peak contamination spread over nearly 50 square miles. For the first time anyone alive could remember, the air hanging above the Owens Valley was nearly clean. But in those shallow, flooded areas, the sections where thin layers of water sat baking beneath the desert sun, upkeep crews began spotting stuff that had zero connection to air quality. Vegetation they never planted, bugs they had never laid eyes on, and birds, a handful at first, then groups, then entire flocks numbering in the thousands. A lakebed that had been devoid of life for the better part of 100 years was reacting to the water almost immediately during its very first season. The whole engineering effort had been aimed at the sky above. Without making any noise about it, it was putting something back together down on the earth. As the thin floodwater spread out over the alkaline clay and then stilled, it produced something this dry lakebed had not held since 1926, a gradient. Close to the inlet pipes, the water stayed fairly fresh. Farther away, where it blended with old salt deposits buried in the basin, the salinity rose. In places where the concentration settled between 25 and 75 grams per liter, that tight chemical range created ideal conditions for enormous algae blooms, the kind that cover any warm, sunlit water if it remains motionless long enough. They did not appear as little scattered patches. They stretched across the shallow flood cells for square miles. That algae became food for the next part of the chain. Alkali flies, a species perfectly adapted to this salty, mineral-heavy water chemistry, moved into the flood cells almost at once. Their larvae grazed on the algae mats. Then the adults appeared by the millions, gathering in thick swarms along every edge of water. A vast supply of food was suddenly waiting right beside the shoreline, and that brought in the birds. The Pacific Flyway, the migration route running from the Arctic tundra all the way to South America, passes directly above the Owens Valley. For shorebirds traveling that 4,000-mile route twice each year, the desert span between the Central Valley wetlands and the Great Basin is the most difficult section. There's almost no water, barely any food, and almost no place to touch down. Before 1913, Owens Lake had been one of the key refueling stations along that path. Once the lake vanished, the birds lost that stop. They were forced to cross the gap without landing. Then, all at once, water had returned. It was warm, shallow, and alive with flies. American avocets, black-necked stilts, white-faced ibis, western sandpipers in the tens of thousands, and eared grebes drifting on the brine pools all arrived. The birds descended, and they continued to come. The reason the counts became so huge was this: the thousands of low earthen berms LWP had constructed to divide the flood zones, strictly for hydraulic control, and to stop water from draining toward the middle of the basin, were creating something no engineer had planned for. They made miles and miles of shoreline, shallow margins where water touches mud, exactly the transition zone feeding shorebirds wait for. The engineered layout generated about 3 times as much of this shoreline habitat as the original natural lake had ever provided. The shape was man-made. The life filling it was not. In April 2013, the Eastern Sierra Audubon Society carried out a survey across the entire lake. The one-day count recorded 115,000 birds, including more than 64,000 shorebirds from 20 different species, all feeding and resting on the industrial dust control grid. Seen from above, the place resembles nothing found in nature. Rectangular ponds, straight-edged blocks of salt grass, gravel bands, and maintenance roads separating the cells. But from the ground, while standing beside a shallow flood area with thousands of avocets circling overhead and the Sierra Nevada rising across the western sky, it looks like what the lake began trying to become again, the instant water touched it. The National Audubon Society named Owens Lake a nationally significant, important bird area. In 2018, it was added to the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, an international status given to sites that support more than 100,000 shorebirds each year. And the chain extended beyond a temporary stopover. The birds did more than visit, they nested. The western snowy plover, a California species of special concern, started breeding on the lakebed. 600 to 700 adults were reproducing there annually. It became the largest snowy plover nesting population anywhere in the state, sitting on an industrial dust control grid built by a water utility because a court ordered it. That nesting pushed the project into an entirely different legal arena. California's Fish and Wildlife Agency claimed authority. LADWP must now keep at least 1,000 acres set aside specifically as shorebird habitat, while also supporting a minimum breeding population of no fewer than 272 snowy plovers, no matter what dust control technique is used on the nearby lakebed. A massive engineering effort created to comply with clean air rules is now also locked into wildlife protection requirements that were not in place when the first water started being pumped. From 80,000 tons of toxic dust blowing into the air each year to 115,000 birds counted on a single spring day. Peak dust has fallen by 96.5%. A shorebird refuge known around the world now sits on what was once the most polluted surface in the history of American air quality. Every step in that chain, from algae to flies to birds to court-ordered obligations, rests on one basic thing: Water. The shallow flooding areas that keep the algae alive, feed the flies, and support the birds can use as much as 51% of all the fresh water LADWP has access to in the Owens Valley during dry years. The city has already spent $2.1 billion on the effort, and it is now working to replace flooded areas with water-free controls, including gravel cover and mechanical tilling, in order to reduce that water use by about half. Each acre changed from shallow flooding to dry dust control is an acre the birds no longer have. The Sierra Nevada snowpack that supplies both the aqueduct and the dust control ponds is declining. Temperatures throughout the basin are climbing. Evaporation is speeding up. The same water this oasis relies on is the water the city relies on too, and it comes from a source that is steadily shrinking. 800,000 years of water drained in 13 years, almost 100 years of dust. And the pace at which life returned, algae within weeks, flies within months, birds in the very first season, may be the most remarkable result in the entire $2.1 billion project. The lakebed was never truly dead. It was just waiting. The change is undeniable. Snowy plovers now nest on land that once recorded the worst particulate reading in the nation. This oasis survives because a city continues paying for water that it is also trying hard to stop using. Its future is not secure. The lake contained water for 800,000 years. It was emptied in 13, and the life that returned without being invited, planned for, or budgeted. All of it depends on whether the water continues to arrive. One action was meant to control dust, but the desert took that water and turned it into a food web. Algae to flies to birds to legal mandate, all in a sequence no engineer ever drafted onto a plan. The system did not require a restoration blueprint. It only needed the surface to stay wet. After that, it built the rest itself. If this kind of cascade fascinates you, the way one targeted fix can trigger results far beyond what anyone intended, that is exactly what this channel is about. Subscribe, and we will see you on the next.